You know, a good reminder from Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 is God always pierces the darkness, always. And the darkness doesn't last.
And the high priest, the great high priest who is Jesus Christ, he puts his hands on your life and you take your hands off and you say, my life is surrendered for your purposes.
Welcome into another episode of the Downline podcast, where we hope this podcast helps you faithfully walk with Jesus while pouring your life into others. This is a ton of fun today. This is, I don't even know if I can say this, but a little bit of a ministry crush of mine for years. Years ago, I got turned onto a podcast called Unbelievable, which was highly formative for me in how to engage unbelievers for the sake of the gospel. It was hosted by a guy named Justin Brierley, who has been gracious enough to join us today for the Downline podcast. Justin, thanks so much for your time.
Jamie, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and obviously being in the UK, you're automatically smarter than the rest of us here stateside.
Yeah, I've often heard this, that somehow having a British accent automatically adds 10 or 15 IQ points. I can assure you that's a complete myth, but I'm glad to have it.
What's fun for me as a Southerner, I grew up in Alabama, is so going to school at Auburn, and I was an English lit major, so we had to study linguistics. And the Southern U.S. accent is actually phonetically the closest to a UK accent.
Is that right?
Yes. So all our Northeastern snobs in the U.S. that look down on us, they need to know that we're actually closer to you guys than they are.
Absolutely. Well, as I say, it's a completely unearned set of IQ points, but I'll take it if it's on offer. Whatever.
That's right. Hey, for those that may not be familiar, kind of with you and your work, and we'll get into some recent books and your new podcast, all stuff that I did my doctorate out of Biola in Christian philosophy, so much of what you do has been so meaningful to me. But maybe give our Downline community that isn't as familiar a little bit of a 30,000 foot view of you and the work you've done and kind of what you're up to now.
Sure. Well, I guess I've been involved in Christian media of some kind all of my adult working life. I grew up, in a Christian context, and sort of went on my own journey towards faith in my late teens. And by my early 20s, I was looking to do something in media. I felt God had given me a calling to evangelize, to kind of do something that involved communication. And so I ended up in radio, specifically Christian radio in the UK. Premier Christian Radio was at the time the only Christian radio station in the UK. It's much, don't have nearly as much of that stuff as you guys have established in the USA. But the particular niche that I kind of found my way into was hosting conversations between Christians and non-Christians, frequently with atheists. And so that was the Unbelievable show, initially just a radio show. So really only reaching a Christian audience, but bringing in these non-Christians to model what a good conversation between a Christian thinker and an atheist would look like. And in the process, I discovered, what I came to understand was technically termed apologetics, the intellectual defense of the Christian faith. Learned an awful lot myself in those early years of hosting the show, was exposed to arguments for Christianity I never knew about, was exposed to objections against Christianity I never knew about, and had to kind of deal with both, just as my listeners had to kind of, deal with them as they heard these, great thinkers, going to and fro on these subjects. Once we kind of started putting it out on the internet, especially, we were early adopters of podcasting way back in 2007. It started to kind of grow organically all over the world, actually. And the fun thing was that the audience wasn't just Christians at that point. A lot of atheists, agnostics, people of other faiths started to tune in because, we would often feature some, fairly well-known atheist secular thinkers. So it was a real amazing opportunity and a challenge to me, in a sense, to now be hosting a show that was reaching at quite a wide range of people. And in a sense was, reaching a lot of non-Christians. And I that meant that I needed to try and do my best as a host of remaining somewhat objective, so that both the guests could do what they needed to do. One of the compliments, as far as I was concerned, one of the best compliments I could receive from listeners, especially non-Christian listeners, was when they emailed in to say, well, I wasn't even sure that I didn't even know you were a Christian until a few episodes in, Justin. because it's not that I was hiding it, but I genuinely wanted to kind of give a level playing field,
Right.
and just have the best arguments out there in conversation. So yeah, it was an amazing run. We eventually, obviously, we also went to video. With YouTube, I ended up writing a book. We had conferences where we would do these things, live events, dialogue events, that sort of thing. And I learned in the process that Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet
Mm,
intellectually.
mm,
The show was kind of birthed in the era of new atheism, when it was very fashionable for people to dismiss and ridicule religion. Uh, and there were lots of big questions flying around in popular culture. But actually, I discovered there are some really good responses to those objections, and that actually, in the long run, a lot of the atheist listeners, I think, who listened, not all of them obviously changed their mind, but I think a
right.
lot of them realized there's more to this than maybe they had realized, because they were encountering cogent, thoughtful Christians on a regular basis, opposite, the atheist thinkers that we had on. So it was an amazing learning experience, one I value, and I've taken all kinds of things on with me, since the days I hosted that. I finished up hosting the show around 2023. It still continues, the Unbelievable Show, with fresh presenters and so on. I've moved on to some new projects, but yeah, it was an amazing show to be able to host for nearly 2 decades.
Well, and if any of our listeners aren't familiar with it, to dig into the archives or even what's still ongoing with Unbelievable, I would highly encourage that. I've got just curious for you, kind of, you mentioned your own journey. And one thing I always loved about you is you didn't shy away from incredibly smart, highly successful, renowned atheists, secularists, whatever it may be, on the show. You pulling any punches. But was there ever a guest you had on? You don't have to say any names or anything, where you were like, "Man, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how this one's going to go."
Totally. Yeah. I mean, there were so many guests where I was trying to bring the very best, most
Yeah.
articulate atheists, onto the show, hopefully to have opposite the very best, most articulate Christian thinkers. Um, so yeah, there were loads of moments where I thought, gosh, this person really knows what they're talking about. They've maybe had a career in kind of trying to undermine people's faith and so on. So there were lots of moments where I had that. I mean, probably the one that most sticks out is the first time that I featured the Bible scholar Bart Ehrman on the show.
Hmm.
And for those
Yeah.
who aren't familiar with Bart Ehrman, he's kind of just a very well-known, popular level Bible scholar, but who himself is an agnostic. He kind of lost his own faith,
Mm.
and he's written a lot of books that are quite skeptical of the historical transmission, for instance, of the New Testament documents and things like that. So his breakthrough best-selling book was called Misquoting Jesus, which kind of
Mm.
cast doubt on whether we can really know what the original manuscript said when it
Okay.
comes to the Gospels and so on. So when the first time I had him on debating that subject, I put him up opposite a New Testament scholar from Cambridge, Peter J. Williams, a Christian New
Okay.
Testament scholar. And I've got to say, yeah, in the week or so leading up to that conversation, I was kind of like, I'd read the book about Ehrman's book, and I was like, wow, this guy has some interesting, quite compelling arguments here. But there's a proverb, isn't there, that says, one person's case seems sure until another person comes to
Till another
answer
person.
it.
That's right.
And it's always, I think, been like that on the show. You realize, people have been thinking about this, writing about this,
Mm.
researching this for a long time. There's always two points of view on anything. And Bart Ehrman is a master at, making a very compelling case to a popular lay audience. But when you actually dig into the detail, it's not as
Mm.
simple as is sometimes represented in those books. And I quickly discovered there's a kind of very compelling argument for the historicity, actually, and the authenticity and the reliability of the transmission of the text. And it's precisely some of the things Bart Ehrman was kind of laying out as supposedly problematic that, just looked at in a slightly different way, turned out to be quite supportive, actually, of the
Yeah.
reliability of the New Testament text. I mean, just one simple example is that Bart Ehrman in that book, Misquoting Jesus, makes a great deal of the fact there are so many variations between the different texts we have,
Mm.
thousands and thousands of texts that have been, copied time and time again over hundreds of years.
Sure.
And he said, if you added all the variations between the texts, the variations are more in number than the actual number of words in the New Testament. Now, all of that is true, okay, but it's what that fails to acknowledge is that the Bible, the reason we have so many texts is because the New Testament is simply the work of ancient literature that has been copied the most times of all.
The
So,
most.
of
Yep.
course, you're going to get masses of variations over centuries of copying. But it's also the fact we have so many copies that go back so far, closer to the events than any other ancient
Any other
literature.
original document. Yeah.
That means we can do the work of critical historiography, where we actually sort of piece together and we recover essentially the original manuscripts to a 99.9% accuracy, as it were. And Bart Ehrman doesn't actually disagree with that actually it's the very fact we have so many, and the fact that therefore there are so many discrepancies between them, that means we can actually work out what the original document said. And so it's the very thing that Bart Ehrman on the one hand paints as a problem that turns out to be the solution to that problem.
Solution. Yeah, isn't that ironic?
So it was kind of some of those types of moments that were just kind of eye-opening light bulb moments where you realize, hey, there's always two sides to all of these issues. So yeah, that's one example though, where certainly I kind of had one of those moments of like slight trepidation, bringing on the atheist agnostic guest in that case.
You mentioned Erdman's book, and I want to mention yours, your newest one. I love the title, "Why You Are Still a Christian." Now I changed the pronouns there in my conversation with you, but what? Just for our audience, at the end of the day, you've got almost 20 years of high-level academic atheist interaction, along with Christian scholars. But just for you, say you end 2 decades worth of that work, what's the most compelling thing you walked away with?
Gosh, that is a tough question, because why I'm Still a Christian, the new book is really all kinds of different strands of evidence and argument that for me make Christianity a compelling view, a compelling worldview.
Right.
I think, it would be remiss of me to say that it's inevitably it's my personal experience that is probably the primary thing, and that's absolutely key, that I really believe and have had, experienced the work of the living God through Jesus Christ in my life. So in a sense, that's very personal to me. That's not something I can hold out necessarily as kind of convincing evidence to a skeptic, someone who just simply hasn't had that. So what I tend to point towards when it comes to skeptics is things where maybe we can share more common ground, at least. And that's where, more classical apologetics comes into view. And so for me, one of the most compelling arguments, I think, for God that speaks to me, and I think has spoken to many other skeptics down the ages, is the argument from morality. And this is an argument. This is essentially the argument that brought, for instance, C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest Christian thinkers of the 20th century, to faith in God from atheism. So this is the view that actually you can't make sense of the idea of right and wrong, good and evil, without a sort of moral lawgiver, something that stands outside of nature, outside of the physical world. If we live in a purely godless, purely materialist universe, there is no such thing in the end as right and wrong. There are just the laws of nature, matter in motion. There may be kind of interesting social contracts we draw up that have sort of some kind of social benefit, but there's nothing true or false or right or wrong about those. They're just kind of socially useful.
Sure. Not in a cosmic sense, is what you're saying.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And yet all of us have a very deep, I think, intrinsic sense that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that there are some right and wrong ways to treat other human beings. And even if everyone disagreed and thought the opposite, it wouldn't mean, well, that's fine, that settles what is moral. We'd know actually they were mistaken. I sometimes use the example, I don't know, of racism. If you had gone back, several hundred years to certain parts of the world, you would find that people of color were treated as inferior to other people. Now, does that mean they were, just because that was the morality of the day. Well, no, we would say from our standpoint, the people who were doing that, who were racist, were mistaken. They were wrong. But the question is, well, why, what makes them wrong? Is it that, because if it's just about the social contract that we happen to develop through, society, evolution, whatever, then that just means that it's the happenstance of whatever we happen to believe at any given moment. But if we believe
that's right.
But if we believe that, we can say they were wrong and we are right, it means we've discovered something objectively true about life, about reality, that there are some wrong ways to treat other people. And if that's true, you've got to ask, where does that come from? It doesn't exist within nature. It doesn't exist, within a purely physical thing. You can't point to some realm of moral laws. So there must be it must transcend the physical world. And I think the only way of making sense of that is if there is, as Lewis came to view it, a moral lawgiver. And we're finding out something new and true about the universe when we arrive at these moral laws. So for me, the reason I find this quite compelling is because it's most people, when they, many of the people I've met who have, their conversion has partly been through this moral argument, is because they've been unable to deny the reality of right and wrong. And to simply pass it off as just, the byproduct of sociocultural evolutionary forces. When you actually experience real injustice, when your daughter gets raped, when you see, evil winning over, good, it's something inside you says, this isn't the way it should be. But the very fact you believe there's a way it should be means that this world is not just a physical material world. There's a shouldness about it. There's something outside of this world that you're appealing to. So for me, it's both an intellectual argument, but it's also something that kind of grabs you, inside.
Deeply personal.
Yeah.
There's a desire there, it seems, within humanity that simply just, it can't be met or at least solved through naturalism or secularism at its deepest, most cosmic level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people are kind of starting to realize this, even non-Christian thinkers. I'm quite good friends with Tom Holland, who's a British historian, quite a well-known podcast host now of something called The Rest is History. And he wrote this sort of best-selling book, Minion, as a secular historian, but just pointing out that our modern belief in the West in human rights, that didn't come from atheism or science or the Greeks or the Romans. It came from Christianity. And that you can't believe, the very belief in the idea of the equal dignity of every human being and their equal right to, food, shelter, education, all of those things that we enshrine in documents of human rights. You can't support that on an atheistic worldview. That's not something that falls out of atheism or science or reason. It's something that only makes sense if you basically have a theological framework for humans, that there's something intrinsically special about humans. The Bible makes perfect sense of that belief in human rights, because if from page 1 it says humans are made in the image of God. And if that's true, if humans are made in the image of God, of course it makes sense to believe in their intrinsic value, worth, and dignity. It's very much, much harder to make sense of that belief on a purely atheist, naturalistic worldview. So I've always, because I so often encounter atheists who are absolutely, devout believers in human rights and justice, it's always the most interesting place to begin sometimes. Well, where did you get that idea from? Because it's not an idea that is easily supported by atheism itself. And I think people like Tom Holland have been really interesting, kind of almost quasi-evangelists, actually, by sort of reminding their secular peers, where did this idea come from? And kind of reminding them it really came from Christianity. Sorry for folks, that's where it all came from.
So what, in your experience, let's say we have a secularist or naturalist, atheist, whatever it is, background, worldview, and they can acknowledge actually atheism doesn't have a good grounding for the origin of objective morality. But there's still another step to take as it relates to the person and work of Jesus. So on one hand, you can get someone to acknowledge that. How do you help them take the next step or actually consider the more specific reality of the person and work of Christ?
Yeah. Well, for me, that's absolutely key. And in a sense, the beginning of my book, the first few chapters of Why I'm Still a Christian, are kind of sketching out a number of different arguments, including that moral argument, but also cosmological arguments and arguments from purpose and meaning, to say there are lots of actually good reasons to disbelieve atheism and to believe in God. Okay, a kind of a cosmic designer, a kind of a moral lawgiver. But then you absolutely have to confront this question. Well, okay, I could have just spelled out a case for perhaps the Islamic God or another God or whatever. It's a kind of it's a fairly generic, potentially, God that you're arguing for on the basis of these more philosophical arguments, if you will. And that's where Christianity again has something very unique about it. It is that it is a faith that it comes from a very specific time and place. 2,000 years ago, a group of people claimed that a person called Jesus Christ of Nazareth had lived, died, and risen again in vindication of his claim that he was the fulfillment of the messianic promises that had been given to the Jewish people and that he was the Son of God. And that's, for me, this is where you to answer the question of why, which God, effectively, you have to say the person who claimed to be God, this person whose life and teachings have had more impact on the world than any other person in history. What if we took seriously their claim that they were God and the fervent belief and accounts of their followers that this person had died and risen again? I think there is an incredibly strong historical case for that. I think, as we were just saying earlier, it just so happens that the New Testament documents happen to stand head and shoulders above any other ancient literature when it comes to their early provenance and the kinds of material we have for them. Now, obviously, they make claims that are supernatural in nature, most specifically the claim that Jesus Christ rose from the dead.
That's right.
But again, when I look at the events surrounding those claims, just at a purely historical level, I think there's a very strong intellectual case that something happened, that those people were not making it up. It wasn't some sort of legendary account that developed over time, that something happened that they really believed was the risen Jesus. And so, yeah, I would want to just encourage anyone who's sort of perhaps had their mind opened to the possibility of God from some of these arguments, whether it be, cosmology or moral argument or some other argument, there are lots out there, to say, is it just a lottery? Might be this God, might be that God, maybe we can't know. Well, actually, I think the unique claim of Christianity is that you can know that God has spoken in time and space by becoming human. So it's, for me, that is worth investigating at the very least. If I would hope anyone who considered themselves a reasonable, intelligent, curious person would at the very least ask themselves, this person who has had easily the most impact on history in the world, I should take a moment to find out more about them,
To at least take it seriously. So you've got Why I'm Still a Christian. You got another work, this, kind of the surprising rebirth of belief in God. And you're far more tapped into this than I am, but what are you your cultural pulse over there in the UK, which a lot of people don't know. I don't even know what the time difference, 6-7 hours is. You're joining us. Yeah.
That's right. I think I'm currently 6 hours ahead of you at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Which, by the way, are we say soccer, which I know is sacrilege to you over there, but do you have a team over there, Premier League team you get behind?
Honestly, I'm not a big football fan, so this is the one area where my Britishness utterly fails me.
My goodness.
I'm afraid. I spent 1 year living in Tottenham, so if there were a team that I could say I supported, because I at least saw a couple of their games, it would be Tottenham Hotspur. But honestly, I don't really follow the football, unlike many of my friends who are absolute football fanatics.
So basically, you experience a freedom in life that the rest of us do not.
Exactly.
Yes.
I don't have to go through the torture that the rest of you guys do. when it
No,
comes
no,
to
no,
sports.
not, college football is so big over here. I went to Auburn, and we basically subject ourselves to masochism
Mm,
every,
yeah,
for 6 months a year.
absolutely. I'm free. I'm free of that.
Yeah, you're
I'm
free.
glad to say. Yeah.
Hey, sensing, you know, rise in belief in God. What are you sensing culturally? I mean, there have been some fairly prominent celebrities and public figures that are much more vocal now about even
Mm,
considering the reality of God. Even, I mean, take Russell Brand. I don't know him,
mm,
but
mm.
he had specific things to say about faith, even mentioning Jesus. Uh, what's your just kind of general feel of the tide of, maybe we call it spirituality in the UK, which inevitably usually jumps the pond and comes over this direction? Just, are you seeing anything that you're encouraged by?
Yeah, I am, and it's interesting you use the word tide because that's the very metaphor I use in my book, The
Mm,
Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and in the podcast documentary series that I've been working on the last couple of years. And I draw that metaphor from, there's this famous poem called Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, a Victorian poet, and it has this famous line about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. The idea that faith is going out on the West, basically, and has, and you could say 150 years from when he wrote that poem, yeah, that the tide of faith has absolutely gone out on the West. We live in an increasingly irreligious, more secular, less Christian age. There's been a steep decline in church going in the UK over many generations. And yet, as one sort of secular intellectual, Douglas Murray, put it to me in a conversation I had with him a few years ago, he quoted this line and he said, "The thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. That's the
mm,
point of tides."
mm.
And he was saying this in the context of seeing in among his peer group a lot of intellectuals starting to talk very differently about
Huh.
Christianity. And I had noticed this too in my circles. As I said earlier, I started the Unbelievable show in the heyday of New Atheism, this very dogmatic, sort of abrasive form of atheism led by people like Richard Dawkins. And, these guys all sold these kind of best-selling anti-God books like The God Delusion. We had a kind of a bus campaign here in the UK that proclaimed there's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And
Mm.
all of this, that was the mood. It was very, you know, secular, very anti-religious. And and that was kind of where these conversations got going initially. But then I noticed a kind of change end of the 2010s, so around 2017, 2018. And I noticed interesting secular intellectuals popping up with very different answers who weren't dismissing and, ridiculing religion. People like Jordan Peterson,
Yeah.
the Canadian psychology professor, in whole auditoriums, theaters for like 2 or 3 hour lectures on the book of Genesis and speaking to this very secular,
Mm.
savvy, young demographic who are exactly the same type of people who had been turning up for the New Atheists only 10 years earlier or so. And I realized, something's changed here. And so I had Jordan Peterson on my show. I had him in debate with a kind of atheist psychologist. And you would have been forgiven for thinking he was like the Christian apologist in this conversation because he was,
Mm.
he was defending, arguing for the idea that you can only make sense of life if we believe we're made in the image of God. Now, Peterson is famously difficult to pin down actually on his beliefs in
Yeah,
God
I've
and
always wondered about
faith.
that.
But nonetheless, it was such a different kind of conversation. And then I started bumping into more and more of these people. The person I mentioned earlier, Tom Holland, this secular historian, but who has made huge waves through this book, Dominion, arguing for the Christian foundations of the West,
Mm.
basically. And so you've got like lots of, and that's just a couple of names among many more that I could mention where I was just noticing a change. And the new atheist thing had kind of waned. It did not feel as relevant. It wasn't where the energy was. I noticed, and then just shortly, so I kind of published this book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, kind of showing a lot of different areas where I was seeing this change in the conversation around God happening, but no statistics per se that contradicted the overall, decline of church going religiosity in the West. And then shortly after the book got published, a really extraordinary story happened. You may not be familiar with the name, but Ayaan Hirsi Ali
Okay.
published an article. Now, Ayaan Hirsi Ali for context, grew up in Somalia, fled Somalia sort of to escape a kind of Muslim cult called Muslim Brotherhood, came to the West, to the Netherlands specifically, became a sort of political activist for free speech and kind of very much against the evils of religion. She published her own sort of anti-God book called Infidel, joined the New Atheist Speaking Circuit, very good friends with Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and the others. Became part, was, often called the fifth horsewoman of the New Atheism, because there were these so-called four horsemen and she was the fifth horsewoman. And that's how I, knew of her and had engaged with her material and so on. And then sort of didn't hear a lot from her for a few years. And then just at the end of 2023, shortly after my book was published, she publishes this viral article online titled "Why I Am Now a Christian."
Wow.
And it was just extraordinary because it was basically the thesis of my book in her own personal story. This kind of the way she'd kind of realized New Atheism couldn't sustain her fundamental beliefs in equality, dignity, compassion, progress, human rights. She'd essentially been kind of converted by the Tom Holland thesis about the Christian West. And a lot of people kind of leapt on the back of this saying, oh, this is just a cultural, political conversion. But she also sort of shared some very, heartfelt interviews about her personal journey. And she'd kind of had a personal meaning crisis where she was depressed, kind of functioning alcoholic, basically, because she'd come to see there wasn't any purpose in life on a purely atheistic framework. But she became very nihilistic, depressed, and went through a number of counselors and psychologists before finally one of them said to her, I think you're spiritually bankrupt, Ayan. And have you thought about praying? And Ayan responded saying, I can't possibly pray. The God I was raised with was a monster. And this counselor said to her, well, if you could believe in a God, what kind of a God do you think you might be willing to believe in? And so Ayan started to describe the kind of God she might be willing to believe in. And she says she realized as she was describing this God that she was essentially describing the character of Jesus Christ.
Man, wow.
And so she thought, well, maybe I don't need to invent a new God. Maybe I need to investigate this person who claimed to be God. And so she started praying and she started going to church. And in her own words, God completely turned her life upside down. And suddenly the depression lifted and she began to encounter something that she hadn't realized was there. And so if it can happen to Ayan Hirsi Ali, the most famous female atheist in the world, it feels like it could happen to anyone right now. And there's something's really changed in our culture. There's been this huge shift at this kind of intellectual level. And you see it in these stories. And you mentioned other, significant personalities who are kind of having really interesting moments. But then, forgive me for the length of this answer, there was this statistics issue, and a lot of people, when the book was published, again said, there's no surprising rebirth, Justin. All of the statistics point in the opposite direction in the West. And I had to admit they were right. And the only statistics I quoted in the book were, showed the same thing. But then I started to hear some really interesting things happening, on the ground in the UK, in the USA. Bible sales were up. And the people driving that apparently were Gen Z. Survey here in the UK showing that Gen Z especially turned out to be half as likely to be atheists as their parents or grandparents. They were, if you like, the most most spiritually open generation, apparently. I started to talk to people who were, someone got in touch from Finland saying, there's just been a survey published showing a significant rise in young men attending church in Finland. It seems really weird and somewhat anomalous, but maybe it's a sign of something that you're talking about in your book, Justin. But then other places started to report similar things. The Catholic Church in France, famously secular country, for 2 years running, reported its largest number of adult converts at their Easter Vigil year on year. And in the UK, I was getting sort of lots of interesting anecdotal stories from pastors up and down the country in the past 2 years saying we're seeing a real rise in attendance. Wow. Loads of people coming through the doors, often young men, interestingly, coming through the doors for the first time. Again, the last 2 years, sort of so many pastors got in touch with me to say we've had our biggest Easter attendance on record. And then the Bible Society, just about 3 months ago, a significant Christian organization here in the UK, published a piece of research called The Quiet Revival. This was so surprising to me. I literally wrote a book called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, but even I was like surprised by this research, because they what had happened was in 2018, they had done a very big, wide-ranging, credible survey through a very trusted kind of polling organization, YouGov, here in the UK, across all demographics, asking questions around religiosity, church going, and everything else. And it all in 2018, the picture was very bleak. It all looked the same as the story of decline that we know of. They'd repeated exactly the same survey, asking the same questions in 2024, just last year.
Okay.
And they received a very, very different set of results. In just 6 years, for instance, among 18 to 24-year-olds, it had gone from about 4% saying that they attended church at least once a month to 16. It had risen to 16% in 2024. So it had quadrupled in just 6 years. And that was even more pronounced among young men. 21% were saying they went to church on a regular basis, which was astonishing.
That's massive.
Yeah. And again, so astonishing to them that they took a while before they released this research, because they wanted to double, triple check it. They knew this was going against the grain. But at the same time, it made sense to me of all this anecdotal stories I was hearing and of other data that was starting to come in. So to cut a long story short, it's been a really interesting couple of years. And what I saw as kind of a change in the intellectual atmosphere and the tide starting to turn, I think is now starting to be backed up by some physical data. And I think what it's pointing to, especially among young people, because this is where a lot of the energy seems to be, is that there's a huge meaning crisis in our culture, and young people want a better story, and they're kind of almost being driven out of desperation to investigate Christianity again, because none of the other stories are working for them. So for me, I'm very encouraged by this. It's a huge challenge and an opportunity for the church, because I don't think this is of our own making. It's not through some great evangelistic program we've launched, anything like that. It's just got the wind of the Spirit is blowing. The things are happening in the world that are driving people, especially young people, back towards faith. And so I just want to shepherd that as best as I can, and join in what God is already doing.
You don't need to apologize for your answer. That was incredibly encouraging. I'm keeping it a little longer than I promised. One more question, if you got time, because in response to that, let me ask you this. Do you think the church is well equipped and ready to meet these, you mentioned crisis of meaning, that maybe the Gen Z is experiencing, or, what are ways we can do to get better prepared to encounter, like you said, kind of the winds of the Spirit that seem to be moving?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that some parts of the church are more prepared than others. I think sometimes the danger is the church is still trying to answer questions that are about 10 or 15 years out of date. And so
that nobody's asking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's what I'm aware of, is a lot of churches are still caught in that new atheist moment, or ministries. They think people are just looking for a philosophical answer to the God question. The reality is most people, especially young people, aren't waking up asking for, give me 5 reasons to believe in God. They're asking for, give me a reason to get out of bed because I'm feeling depressed and anxious. And that's the reality. It's the existential sort of stuff that young people are going through. And that's why they're turning up at church. If they're turning up, they're looking for a story to make sense of their life, because the stuff they've been given by the secular culture has just let them down. Empty promises of science, technology, all the ideologies that are on offer, they're not working. They're just creating a lot of depressed, confused,
that's right,
anxious people.
Lonely, isolated.
Yeah.
Everything.
And so the church just needs to do what it's always done best, which is to be a community of love and grace that comes around people in all their messiness, accepting that when the meaning seekers come to their doors, it's going to be a messy business.
That's right.
But but seeking to do what Jesus always did for messy people, and that's to treat them with love and grace and take them on a journey, and so it's kind of quite simple, really. At one level, it's about creating that space, especially for young people, to find genuine human community. I think for me, this has just become more and more apparent. Is that's what young people are desperately lonely in a way, and they've been forced to curate a kind of image online that is so burdensome and so
and it's
draining.
disembodied, right? There's nothing incarnational about the digital image.
Yeah. And they're looking for a place of grace and genuine human contact. And that's what the church is made for, So it's not that I'm not saying the church needs to do anything too fancy or reinvent itself. Just do well the things that you're called to do well. And you might just find this is the moment when people are ready to hear the message. We can certainly, one of the things that I've also been kind of keen to emphasize in the book and my podcast series is that when I do speak to some of these secular intellectuals who are kind of on the verge of faith, interested in Christianity, they're looking for something quite, well, the way I put it is that what they often say to me, people like Tom Holland, when he does go to church, he goes to a very kind of old, ancient form of church, full of ritual, full of kind of mystery. And he says, if you want to attract me to Christianity, Justin, then keep Christianity weird. He says, don't like dumb it down. Don't make it super accessible. Don't make it like just a warmed over version of what I can already get in the culture. Okay. And that may be kind of, so it's interesting. This Quiet Revival research is showing that the two parts of the church that's seeing the most growth are that interesting, that more liturgical high church end, but also the charismatic and Pentecostal end. And they've both got their weirdness in different ways, but I think it's that search for something different to what they've been given in the culture. And so the churches that are still, I think, flatlining are the churches that have kind of surrendered their identity to the culture and said, we're just going to try and be a, slightly more spiritual version of what you can already get. Just so for me, it's about like being comfortable in our own skin. We are different. We are weird as Christians. It's always been weird.
It's always been weird.
But that's fine. People actually need weird. They need something that's different. So don't be afraid of being different. And you might just find it's actually one of your most attractive qualities right now for young people.
Well, that's a great word, and I've broken my promise to you, so I'll wrap it up there. But I do want to say, to our listeners, if you aren't familiar with Justin, check out Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, both the book and he's got a series of, are you just calling them episodes or podcasts? Or
it's a documentary podcast, yeah. So wherever you get podcasts from, Apple, Spotify, you can find the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So yeah, book and podcast series.
And then Why I'm Still a Christian, great work from Justin and all of his years in the media and talking to atheists and new atheists along the way. Justin, this was such a treat for me. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jamie.
I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Downline podcast. Please subscribe and go down and rate us and give us 5 stars. Help us get this content out to as many people as possible, as we hope to continue to equip men and women to join the Great Commission as we make disciples for a lifestyle that's a lifetime.